I'm happy to have a chance to present the people which will do the real presentation of the book. First, definitely our guest, a good friend of mine, Gideon Rachman, chief political correspondent of Financial Times, and the author of the book, The Strongman, How the Cult of the Leader Destroys Democracies in Bulgarian Epochete and Autocratite. Gideon, please take a seat. Yeah. Vessela Tcherneva, probably one of the stars of European and world knowledge in Bulgaria, Deputy Director of the European Council for Foreign Relations, and prominent speaker in the different places in the world. She also will fly this evening as Gideon. Gideon is flying to London, Vessel is flying to Berlin. It's an important place now for Europe and for us. Vessela Tcherneva.
Thank you.
And the deputy editor-in-chief of Dnevnik newspaper, Peter Karaboev, the person who I think in the last 2-3 years rise as a really a star of analyzing the foreign policy stories, not only in the newspapers, recently become a very good. The floor is theirs.
Okay, welcome everyone. This session will be in English. If you need translation, you got instructions. Please, telephones, smartphones on an airplane mode or quiet. Let's start with my position as a journalist. Actually, we are colleagues to some extent with our distinguished guest. I will never forget how this year on June the 27th, I woke up at 4 in the morning just to watch the Trump-Biden debate, to see it personally myself, the disaster of something which in general they said it doesn't matter. Debates are just old-fashioned way of getting more viewers and probably voters. And then it was never forgetting example. Then I woke up again in the morning to see the next debate between Trump and Harris, to learn where exactly in Springfield they eat the cats, the dogs and the pets of the people there. Actually, it was quite serious, probably with the consequences extremely serious for Trump himself, his campaign, and hopefully from my side for Mrs. Harris. And tomorrow morning, I will wake up at 4 in the morning to watch the only debate between the candidates for vice presidents, J.D. Vance and Tim Walz. Why? Because Trump is almost 80 years old. And if he wins in a month from now, on the 5th of November, and something happens during his second mandate, J.D. Vance is going to become the president of the United States, and he's probably the future of Trumpism without Trump. Enough reasons to do my duty. But I told you that story because we will start with American elections. It's almost already a cliche that the second important elections of the year for Europe are going to happen on 5th of November, after the ones for European Parliament in early June. Why is the question for you both, but let's start with a, let's say, bold prognosis, your expectations for the 5th of November, probably a couple of $1 billion question.
Yeah, well,
Mr. Rachman.
I can't tell you anything very original. I mean, it's very close. But I think that it would be a mistake to write off Trump's chances. I think, if anything, I would have him as a narrow favorite, despite the debate with Harris, because If you look at the opinion polls, she, on the national polls, on a kind of good day, is 2 or 3 points ahead. But because of the way the Electoral College is structured in America, she essentially has to be 4 or 5 points ahead to be sure of victory. And then, of course, it comes down to these swing states where it's level. But I'd point out that in the last 2 presidential elections, Trump has done better than the opinion polls suggested. So I certainly wouldn't write Trump off. That would be obviously idiotic. And maybe I'm just a pessimist, but I would make him a narrow favorite to win.
And it will be pivotal for democracy in the world, in the so important elections year 2024.
Yeah, I mean that is the key question. I mean, as you know, Biden tried to run when he was running on the threat to democracy idea, which I think is correct, but it didn't really land with the American electorate. They didn't seem to care. I mean,
old-fashioned?
I don't know why, but just to remind people, I mean, I think Trump did basically attempt a coup d'etat on January the 6th, 2020. He hasn't been brought to trial for it, but he clearly rejected the results of a democratic election. And in a well-functioning democracy, that should rule you out forever, really. But it hasn't. And so we know his attitude to democracy. And I think the other thing is that, you know, one possible source of comfort is he's been president before for 4 years, and American democracy survived and the republic survived. And that is important to remember. But I think he's been radicalized by the experience of losing and by also being put on trial, albeit unsuccessfully. And the people around him are likely to be more radical and less establishment than they were last time. And a lot of them are very angry. I mean, people like, you know, I was at the Republican convention in Milwaukee, and one of the many bizarre moments was when Peter Navarro, his former trade advisor, arrived to speak. And Navarro had been released from prison that morning and appears on the platform. Steve Bannon, who would probably serve in a second Trump administration, is currently in prison. So these guys will want to come out and take revenge. They'll want to try and put their enemies in prison. And I think that they will also try to purge what they call the deep state. They'll sack a lot of people, not just the top people, but other levels in the Department of Defense, in the CIA, in the FBI. They'll try to turn them into instruments of Trump's power rather than neutral instruments of the government, which is a classic authoritarian tactic. But to end on a slightly more positive note, I don't think it's possible to turn America into a dictatorship, certainly not in 4 years' time. The Trump people have a slightly sinister attachment to Viktor Orban. They're very fascinated by him. Trump praises him constantly. Orban has spoken at CPAC, which is the main conservative association. So they're really interested in him. And you could argue that the famous Project 2025, which they're now trying to distance themselves from, lays out a platform for how to do that to the United States. You know, take over the state, pack the judiciary, pack electoral commissions, and so on. But, you know, Hungary is a small country. It's 9 million people with a relatively fragile recent democratic tradition. America's 333 million people of long-established democracy with many diffuse sources of power. So, you know, the federal government's incredibly important, but you have, you know, the richest and most powerful states, California, New York, will be run by the Democrats. There are many, independent sources of wealth in the United States. You can't immediately co-opt or coerce every rich person in America or every newspaper. So he can do a lot of damage, but I don't think Trump could turn America into a dictatorship. That's not going to happen. And so, you know, even if he were to be elected, I don't think it would necessarily be the end. I mean, I think that maybe rather than Viktor Orban's Hungary, you might look a bit, say, at Bolsonaro's Brazil, where there was a lot of chaos, a very divided society, a lot of controversy. But in the end, Bolsonaro lost the next election because the basic democratic structures survived.
And they stormed the parliament too.
Yeah, they did attempt to storm the parliament. And interestingly, they failed in Brazil. It was a very similar effort. And in fact, I think as far as we know, the Biden administration intervened and actually rang the Brazilian military and said, don't even think about backing this. And they didn't. And that was important.
Definitely, United States as a society, as an economy, needs change and improvement, like every society. So, a couple of words about Kamala Harris, because you talked a lot about Trump, but
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that Harris, in a way, her weakness is that she is the continuity of Biden. And that is, people say, how could anyone vote for Trump? I don't understand it. Well, if you look at the opinion polls, like 61% of Americans want radical change in America. And it's hard to argue that Kamala Harris represents radical change. She's continuity. That said, I think the Democrats are still learning the lessons of 2016 and the presidential election. And the main lesson they learned is that too many Americans, particularly in the heartland of the country, felt that they had suffered from globalization and were susceptible to Trump's economic appeal, so that they have also, for better or worse, embraced some of Trump's protectionism. They haven't got rid of the tariffs that he imposed on China. And their main addition is to try to have a very organized industrial policy to pour money into the strategic industries of the future as they see it. So in particular, green technology, the Green New Deal is their big thing. And they're hoping to reindustrialize America with a kind of green tinge, and that will address a lot of the economic anxieties and discontents that fuel Trumpism. But the one thing they perhaps didn't anticipate is that a combination of Trump's tax cuts and then Biden's stimulus stoked inflation. And so most Americans think the economy is not doing well, and that's because very basic things, the price of petrol, the price of groceries, and people say, well, petrol cost this under Trump and it's now this under Biden, or, bread cost this and now it costs that. And, the kind of arguments that Biden would want to make about democracy or whatever seem to be being trumped by the price of petrol.
yeah, thank you. You almost touched the question of left behind people,
Yeah.
which are the most, I would say, basic part of Trump supports.
Yeah, and I think, we think of America as a very rich country, and it is in many ways, but most Americans don't have any savings.
Yeah, this was a bridge towards
Yeah.
European situation, Bulgarian situation too. My question towards Ms. Tcherneva is Europe ready for new Trump? This is the talking on the continent for almost 2 years. Be ready, be prepared for he's coming back, and yet your answer.
This is a trap. This question is a trap. I will go to your first question about the prediction, if you allow me.
Okay, please.
Because I believe that, I of course agree with Gideon that it's very close, but in the end, there is more kind of momentum, I would say, more energy in Harris's campaign. And so for now, it actually looks that if we are to bet, maybe that would be the better bet. You're right. Trump is the big kind of danger for Europe on many accounts. I believe, and we can unpack this if you want, I believe that Trump is going to have much more impact on politics rather than on policies, because on many issues there will be similarities between the two administrations. In terms of policies, the big areas where there could be difference are two areas very close to home. One is Ukraine, the other one is Western Balkans. We know that what Trump is saying about Ukraine, that he's going to end the war in 24 hours. Nobody knows how. But basically for Europeans, the choices are, do we continue support Ukraine if the American president tomorrow says we stop and withdraw all the equipment that we have given and so on? Can Europe basically fill the gap? Secondly, can we be prepared in case there is a Harris presidency? Can we be prepared for a much more, let's say, gradual American withdrawal from European defense, but one which is not going to provoke us to act, right? Because we can lay back and say, fine, it's more of the same, it's continuation of Biden, and in a way, what is there to worry about?
Peace dividend again.
So, and we can continue talk about European defense, but in the end, not much will materialize. So I think these are the two big risks. And the second area, the Western Balkans, I believe is a big and maybe a bit under the radar area where Trump has a fixation. His candidate for National Security Advisor, Mr. Grenell, who was his also special envoy for the Balkans in his first administration, has this idea about land swap. And for those of us here in the region, land swap means redrawing borders in Europe along ethnic lines. This has been a very big, let's say, no-go ever since the Yugoslav wars. So from an American point of view, this looks like a quick fix, right? I put those two small leaders from small countries at the table, they sign, and I have a deal. But for us here in the region, this can be a very big headache. Is Europe prepared? I think a lot of capitals are thinking about this very much. However, they are not prepared to talk about this. They are not even prepared to confess that their foreign ministries are drawing plans. And I know this because I'm talking to colleagues from across Europe. On the record, they would deny that there is any sort of work in writing. But of course, some of them try to normalize Trump. Others are trying to use this as an opportunity. And here, obviously, there are differences between France and Germany, between Italy and Poland. But in the end, I think it will be crucial for Europe to have a common approach to whoever is in the White House, and especially if it's Trump, because we know that Viktor Orban is going to try and go as rotational president of the EU to Washington to congratulate Trump as president-elect. And probably he's going to do this even if Trump loses, because we saw the last time around when Trump was contesting, Viktor Orban basically congratulated him. So maybe we will see Europe being involved in this type of contested election in the US. So yes, we're very connected, but I think for Europeans it's crucial now that we think in a very focused way in the run-up to this election, but especially in the days after.
A couple of words for Bulgaria.
This is a historic election for Bulgaria because in countries like Bulgaria, Trump's return would mean giving wind in the wings of, all the Orbans of this part of Europe. We have several leaders in this country who would like to imitate Viktor Orban in his ways, and so bringing Trump back will mean for all of them that they get a free pass on a lot of things where they feel constrained right now. And we can discuss various portfolios, and especially on foreign policy, on energy policy, but also I would say in our European policy, there will be quite a lot of implications. My worry is that the return of Trump coinciding with the ascendance of, Kickl in Austria, or AfD in Germany, or Marine Le Pen in France, it looks actually very dangerous. But it's even more dangerous for us, because for our democracies, the risk is much greater that our institutions are not going to be able to keep up with the constitutional order.
Yeah, thank you very much. Mr. Rachman, your observation on American Europe and preparedness of the continent. And today we had a conversation with you. I took an interview. Tomorrow it will be published on Dnevnik. You said that Orban is popular even in China.
Oh, very.
Something that quite a few people know or ever heard here in Sofia or in Europe. So your observations on Europe? And,
Yeah.
and a couple of words on Orban too, please.
Well, just on Orban in China, yeah, and I was in Beijing in April, and I was the guest of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and they had a Europe office in Budapest, and the guy who was my kind of showing me around Beijing was going to Budapest the day afterwards to spend a month there. They're very close ties with between Orban and China. I don't think the Republican Party has noticed them, but for Orban, interestingly, when he chucked the Central European University out of Budapest, the next thing he did was invite Fudan University from Shanghai to open up, because he doesn't have any problem with the authoritarianism of China, and he rather admires probably the sort of one-man rule of Xi Jinping, and I think he thinks that he can be China's gateway into Europe, that they'll build factories in Hungary, and that'll be good for Hungary, and the Chinese think he can be their disruptor inside the European Union, as Putin does and as Trump does. I don't know whether they can all be right, but maybe they can be. So that's that. But I mean, yeah, no, I share what we just heard, the concerns about the encouragement that authoritarian populists would get if Trump wins. Because I think there's such a thing as sort of global political fashions. And we saw after 1989, everybody thought, okay, well, the wind is in the sails of democracy. And you know, people who weren't Democrats kind of had to get with the program because that was the way things were going. And Orban, in fact, said something rather sinister a while back, where he said, we used to think that Europe was our future. Now we know we are the future of Europe. And the people who think that Orbanism is the future of Europe will be enormously encouraged if they see Trump winning. And they will feel permission to say and do all sorts of things. For example, we have the Austrian Chancellor, potentially the leader of the FPO, breaking a real taboo in Europe by talking about kicking people out of the country, remigration, he calls it. Well, if Trump is deporting huge numbers of people out of the United States, people here will say, well, that's the way to do it, you know? And so you'll get this swing to the far right. And I think that you'll get really a division opening up in Europe between the forces that take their lead from the sort of populist authoritarianism of Trump and Putin. So if you have a sort of Moscow and Washington kind of pushing in the same direction, but they will be fighting in a struggle with the kind of liberal forces in Europe. But a moment of encouragement, I think it's be a big mistake to say, well, the liberal forces will be routed. Not at all, because it is true that you can see all these movements across Europe, but they control relatively few countries. I mean, Hungary, Slovakia, perhaps the feet. So generally, the AfD parties are getting about 30% of the vote, which is big, but it's not a majority. The biggest, most powerful countries in Europe, Germany, France, the UK, remain pretty secure liberal democracies. There is a question about Le Pen in 2027. So, and the European Commission, you know, which has a lot of money and power and legal authority, is, you know, the guardian of the European project. So I don't think it's over at all, but these countries and institutions would be very severely challenged, no doubt about it.
Yeah. Ms. Tcherneva, one more time about the left out people, left behind people, forgotten one. Why should we so concerned about the AfD winning in Germany, while it is actually a local phenomenon? It's former GDR, it's based in Eastern Germany. Why should we care about problems in Poland? Why PIS started from the specific southeastern part of Poland? Many troubles for the liberal democracy actually are quite tightly locally based. How it is going to be a threat for whole of European Union and European project?
The so-called fringist parties, the far right and the far left, they actually did not gain during the last European Parliament elections as much as many of us were predicting. But the fact is that they're there, they're growing, and especially in some key countries, they're getting traction. They will be in local governments in Germany, and maybe they will be in the French government in 2 years' time. And the question is, what is that they really want? In 2019, the EP elections were actually created as a big drama, and this was because those parties were thought to want to dissolve the EU. Let's kill the project altogether. Now they actually are trying to change the EU from within. In my mind, this will mean mostly having a EU in terms of maybe the market, and a couple of big countries boxing through their interest on whatever there is left as a common policies. For a country like Bulgaria, this is going to be detrimental, because that will mean that the whole principle of solidarity, one country, one vote, is going to be basically gone. And we see this already now. I mean, the nationalists of Italy and Austria are not finding it easy to find a common language in Europe, in the European Parliament and elsewhere. This is going to proliferate. So the idea that the parts put together make a larger sum than themselves on their own right, this idea is going to be defeated. And to me, this is the big challenge. Talking about the, as you call them, left behind people, in the US, it has also a bit of a religious connotation. So I'll try to zoom out a little bit. J.D. Vance, the candidate for vice president, became famous writing a book called Hillbilly Elegy. And Hillbilly Elegy is about the kind of Republican working class. So these are conservative people who have worked in the old industries of America, which has been moved elsewhere, and they have lost their status, their jobs, their income, and so on. So the whole theory behind the new Trump approach to America is actually about this kind of Republican Party of the working class. They say it's not us anymore on the golf courses. It's the Democrats. We're the ones who are there for the small people. The fact of the matter is that there is very little that the two parties really do differently in terms of industrial policies. What Gideon just mentioned, the Inflation Reduction Act that was introduced by Biden is actually a project of reindustrialization of America, but on a different scale, on a
For 21st century.
Exactly, on a technologically better scale. And it has, of course, a climate dimension to it, but it is, in its essence, a technological kind of leap, huge leap that he's aiming to finance, and which is actually already getting some traction. So my only meeting with somebody from J.D. Vance's environment was somebody who, of course, was a foreign policy person. And he said, I asked him about NATO, and he said, what about NATO? What is this alliance in which there are countries like Bulgaria or North Macedonia who cannot contribute anything to NATO security? Why do you think we should at all be interested in this? And this is the moment when you realize that the whole idea of American isolationism, which stems from the theory of, America being self-sufficient, not wanting to be used by others to spread its security resources to other countries, it is going to actually impact especially Europeans. Europe is full of smaller countries, and it is going to impact those alliances which actually, like NATO, and especially NATO, which relies on the sovereignty and the idea that it's a one for all principle.
I'm trying to avoid the Middle East and Netanyahu.
Especially today, it's difficult.
And Netanyahu in context of your book about the autocrats. But we will, so at some point, we will reach it. Staying in Europe, I can't avoid the war in Ukraine. But instead of going into the details of what the victory in peace means, could you please talk with us about how do you see the future of our architecture of security in Europe? Because it's totally dependent on the exit of this war. And it's just 3 months before the war started, there were 2 Russian documents about the positioning of NATO in Europe and something more about their role in the world. And they didn't forget it. They will remind us when the time comes. How the future of Europe works if the war is unwinnable, if we have a Korean or German scenario.
Yeah. Well, before I get to that, just on Vance, I mean, I think another thing to understand about, the left behind, the sources of American discontent is America's very war weary. I mean, America's fought 2 long wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, a lot of casualties, a lot of people traumatized by fighting in those wars. More American soldiers killed themselves after coming back from Afghanistan than were actually killed in the war. These were people predominantly not from Washington or New York or California, but from these left behind areas. So when Vance says, why are we paying for the defense of Europe? And incidentally, Europe has these great welfare states, which we don't have, and we're expected to pay 4% for defense to defend them.
He pointed Germany specifically.
Yeah, absolutely. It kind of makes sense if you're sitting in the heart. People are fed up of being the world's policeman. And so I don't think we can just say, well, it's obviously irresponsible. And I actually think in the long run, it's not in America's interests to let NATO collapse. But, the arguments for America being in NATO in the end are rooted all the way back in the 1940s. And, Biden remembers them, but he's 80. A lot of Americans, they don't really get it anymore. And so that's, I think, where a lot of this is coming from. And it's why also I think you're right to remind us that even if Trump doesn't win, I don't think you can take America's continued commitment to Europe at the same levels for granted, particularly given that there's voices saying, look, the real challenge is China, and we can't support the security both of Europe and of China. Europe's going to have to do more. But in terms of the war, what happens? Well, it very much depends on, obviously, how the war ends. But I think that one of the distinctions between Trump and Harris, Biden, is that both of them want a peace settlement at this stage. But I think the difference is probably that the Democrats take the idea of trying to preserve a viable Ukrainian state with some kind of security guarantees seriously. Whether it's doable, I don't know, but that would be something they took very seriously. Trump, I think, would take whatever nonsense Putin, he'd just want a ceasefire, stop the war, wouldn't be very interested in giving Ukraine a security guarantee. And so I think the Ukrainian nightmare that the Russians would, even if, and incidentally, there's no guarantee the Russians would take that. They might just keep rolling if they think that they're winning the war. And particularly if they think that the American aid to Ukraine is going to stop. They might think they can just keep going forward. So don't assume that Russia would be up for a peace negotiation. But if they were, they would want the kind of peace where there was absolutely no question of Ukraine joining NATO. And I think that you just reminded me, those Russian documents from before the war, they also said, maybe NATO out of all the enlargement of NATO, because their argument is that there was a betrayal after 89 and that we had said not 1 inch of expansion of NATO. Yeah. So I think they would see a reversal of that and taking all of the Eastern European countries, Central European countries out of NATO as a legitimate goal. And, maybe Trump would say, okay, I don't know. Yep. It's not inconceivable.
1997 line.
Yeah.
It was in these documents. Your comment on the war and expectations and I don't know, Bulgarian debate, if there is a debate at all for Bulgarian national interest and security interest coming from this conflict and how we can contribute for the victory or for the peace solution, I don't see a fear factor in Bulgarians. Do you fear actually is there a real danger for Bulgaria as a country, as a system, as a freedom place coming from this? They're just wait and see, expecting something. We will revive again the good relationship with Russia. It is in political parties' programs for the forthcoming elections even. So your expectations and what you see and hear in Europe, what are they talking about?
I think the most preferred scenario in Europe right now is a war end which satisfies, first of all, the Ukrainian state to continue existing. So this is condition number one. That means that it should have the agency to choose its alliances, and it should be able to obviously guard its borders. Number two, Ukrainians themselves, and we at ECFR did a public opinion poll on this also in Ukraine. Ukrainians say that while they would like to keep the territories which are currently occupied by Russia within Ukraine, they're ready to consider them not controlled by the Ukrainian government if they are given sufficient security guarantees for their sovereignty. What does it mean in practical terms? It means that because we don't want to send troops to guard the Ukrainian border on the other side, because we don't want to put more serious weapons in there, the only option that is really considered, I think, seriously, is the option for inviting Ukraine to become NATO member as part of a peace package, as part of a peace deal, as a result of which, in the end, basically Article 5 will be the political guarantee for Russia not starting the war again.
Very short intervention from my side, because probably because the security guarantees to Ukraine should be accepted or respected by Putin too.
Exactly.
And he respects only the Article 5.
Exactly.
I think so.
So far.
Yeah.
But also the question is, there are two questions. First, how can we make sure that Russia doesn't regroup, it doesn't start a war again in 4 years? Let's say Trump strikes a deal with Putin and says, you stop fighting now, but in 4 years, I don't care what you do, right? So that's number one. And here is where Article 5 comes in, but it's also about the question of NATO as a whole, which we discussed. And question number two is, in case Trump basically withdraws, how much can Europe really continue putting into this war and into guaranteeing the peace afterwards? We have a situation right now whereby many people think how to bring Russia to the table, to the negotiating table. The only way to do this seems to be really these strategic strikes deep into Russian territory. But in practical terms, we don't know what can make really Putin change his
Well,
mind.
one thing, I mean, I actually don't think strategic strikes into Russian territory would necessarily bring him to the negotiating table. I just think it would probably cause him to get even more brutal in his war. But I think one thing that is possible, no guarantees, is that Putin is waiting for Trump. And
Yes.
if the Democrats win, then he'll have to look again at the situation and say, oh, okay, maybe aid to Ukraine is going to continue for another year, for a year after that, and then he'll have to rethink. And certainly when talking to the people around Biden a couple of months ago, they were saying that's one of the reasons that it's very, very important that Harris win, because they do think there's going to have to be a negotiation, but they don't want there to be a negotiation where Putin thinks he's going to win anyway because Ukraine's about to be abandoned by the West. They want him to negotiate thinking, okay, I know this war's going on for a long time. Maybe I need to come to the table. And even there, they don't assume that that's the calculation he'll make. But it's more possible if Ukraine doesn't seem to be on the point of collapse anyway.
In your newspaper today, there is a long story about Ukraine, and
Yeah.
somewhere deep down was buried speculation that Biden is coming to Europe in mid-October, if I'm not wrong, something like this, and they
Haven't
expect
seen
him to announce something about Ukraine and NATO. Should we just bet on this? He's just on the way out. He might do a weak service to even to Kamala Harris.
The thing is that anything he says could be reversed 2
Yeah.
months later. And the other thing to remember, I mean, I don't think what say it's insignificant. He can move the debate and put ideas on the table that stay there.
Yeah.
But obviously there's no guarantee that, because he's not going to be president quite soon. I think the other thing to remember, though, is NATO membership has to go through the US Congress. And if that's controlled by the Republicans, I don't think they're going to accept it.
And through all the
And through every
allies, parliaments.
And remember, look, if Finland and Sweden were held up for 9 months, imagine what
Yeah,
would happen
yeah.
with Ukraine.
Budapest and Turkey too, and Ankara too.
Yeah, sure.
Another part of this conversation I wanted to dedicate to the role of United Kingdom in Europe, and with the new government with huge mandate. What are the opportunities for the country and Europe? Yesterday, I think, was a story about UK universities who were complaining and asking the government just to restart let's say the channels with Europe, the Erasmus program, because they need European youths and talents. So there is something in the air, but should we bet too much on this?
Look, I mean, I think that there is a big opportunity, but I wouldn't bet on very rapid progress quickly. I think it'll be a gradual process of rebuilding ties and step by step, because firstly, there was a big rupture of trust and a lot of ill feeling on both sides after Brexit. Second, both sides start from a political situation that makes it difficult for them to make big leaps. So because Starmer was worried that he would be accused of wanting to reverse Brexit, he has ruled out not just rejoining the EU, but rejoining the single market, rejoining the customs union. Now, personally, I think that's not going to hold in Britain for very long, because I mean, assuming the EU still exists post-Trump, but let's say it's still there, because young people overwhelmingly voted against Brexit, and something like 80% of people under 35 think it was a mistake. So over time, I think there will be a constituency to rejoin the EU, even though that will be very difficult, and perhaps when people understand the details, like we'll have to join the euro, would have to join Schengen, that might come down again. But I think the direction in Britain is that leaving the EU was a mistake, and at the very least we need closer ties. And I think that on the European side, it helps a lot that it's no longer the Conservatives who brought Brexit about who are in government. So they know that Starmer opposed Brexit. So some of that hostility goes away. And also that the Europeans now, faced with all these challenges, Trump, Putin, can no longer really afford to think of Britain as the main enemy, which in a way it was after Brexit. There was a great focus on demonstrating that Brexit was a mistake. Now they have to, I think they should begin to think of Britain as another middle-sized, stable, liberal democracy with very similar interests to France, Germany, Spain, and, Bulgaria, frankly. And that it would be folly if we didn't find ways of cooperating. Now, what those are for politicians and diplomats to work out. But it'll be things like students to start with, but also making trade easier, making investment easier. Of course, there are issues about how you do that and so on, but that has to be the direction of travel, I think, without
And
doubt.
in terms of security, a country with nuclear weapons, but just 70,000
army. Yeah, well, it's going to. That's where Britain's going to start with it, because it is the strongest card, and it's also something that the Europeans would clearly want from Europe. It is true that Britain's military is much too small. I mean, certainly the army is too small. But on the other hand, the British have made significant contributions to the Ukrainian war effort in terms of kit, intelligence, so training, all of that. Yeah, that I think that after Germany and the US, they're the second biggest donors. They're the third biggest donors of military aid. The missiles that Ukraine wants to fire into Russia are British missiles. So there's a lot of advanced stuff that we have and some expertise and links into the United States. I think that the two things to say about that military link. First of all, that the British, I think, almost definitely want to use it as a wedge. So they're working on a security treaty with the Germans, bilateral security treaty, which will start with defense, but then will define defense very broadly to have technological cooperation, cyber cooperation, cooperation on information warfare, exchange of information, and sort of build out from there so that you kind of edge into economics from that start of defense and security. And the second thing is that Britain has bilaterally built up this thing called the Joint Expedition Force, JEF, with the sort of Scandinavian countries. I think the Poles are in it, and there's talk of Germany and maybe one day Ukraine joining it. So it could. I mean, it's not a proper alternative to NATO because it doesn't have a security guarantee and it doesn't have the United States, and those are two pretty big things not to have. But it's an indication of how we're beginning to think creatively about, what other security arrangements can we have in Europe that don't undermine NATO, but maybe prepare us for a day when NATO is a bit weaker than it was.
The same question.
So 2018, Brexit was really the beginning of an awful cycle. Then Trump came and there was a big kind of stress for the whole Western system. So now we hope that with this coming closer of the UK to the EU, there will be also a new positive impulse in this cycle. I don't know whether we can say that Harris is going to win because of that, but in any case, the UK is key, especially in this security situation for the EU. I would add one thing, also from where Gideon stopped. There is this initiative called European Political Community, EPC. It's an attempt to create a continental European, continental, not EU, but obviously encompassing the UK.
And the last summit was in UK.
Some sort of initiative where Europeans can talk about their interests and can talk about security, about energy, about migration, about connectivity, and so on and so forth. This is something where the UK has been very active. And I believe, The next one is going to be in Budapest on the day after the Trump election. So
You're
I'm
kidding.
not.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So I'm not very hopeful about that one.
An interesting atmosphere.
I bet. But then the next one in spring is probably going to be the real continuation of the process.
And thinking about the future, probably not so distant, when UK and Europe will just shake hands and rejoin again. Do really someone in Europe, in the European capitals, is thinking about, yes, we should work about getting them on board again? And to Mr. Rachman,
Come on.
Yeah.
Michel Barnier, who is going to be who is the Prime Minister of France now, has been so much on this file. I mean, he's so much engaged thinking about the UK to begin with.
What do you think he wants to bring Britain back in? His great achievement is getting us out.
I think he's going to think about Europe and Britain in any event.
Sure.
And this is already a good start.
Yeah, no, I agree.
yeah, first he will think probably first France and Britain, but let's think. And the second point, Europe should do much better to sell itself to the world and to London too, because you need a much better union, much better understanding, functioning, rule of law, whatever in Europe, if you want to be a, let's say, good stock on the market, on the world market.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, the British debate is always stuck 10 years in the past. So a lot of the Eurosceptics were reacting against the integration of the 1990s and hadn't really noticed what had happened since. And I think the pro-Europeans in Britain have not perhaps caught up with the trouble that the German economy is in, the difficulties in European politics. So they actually have a very rose-tinted view of Europe, that it's like this lost paradise that we walked out of. They might sort of get a nasty shock if they actually listen to debates like this. But I mean, I think that, for a lot of British people, it's more that they were promised that things would be a lot better if we left the European Union. It was a bit like Trump, we give them all this money and we'll keep all this money and we can spend it here. It was a very simple promise, and it was a simple-minded promise. And they've noticed that the economy, if anything, is worse. And so there's that. We didn't get anything out of this. But also the loss of quite simple things. People are upset that it's harder to travel to Europe. It's harder to get a job there, take a job there. And those practical benefits, I think, are more what people think about than the geopolitical thing. And I think the other thing is that Brexit was sold as a way of reducing immigration. And people have noticed it hasn't. We've just swapped European immigrants for immigrants from Nigeria and India.
Yep. We're approaching the end of this conversation and discussion. Did we miss something important not included that you want to add?
Like the whole world. I mean, not that we missed it, but I mean, we could go on for 24 hours.
Yes, but staying in Europe. Okay.
Can I ask Gideon a question?
Yeah, please.
Because we have gathered here also to get your book for those of us who don't have it. If you were to write this book again today, what would you say? What is the autocrat of tomorrow, especially having in mind Trump, but also the whole China rivalry, problems of Europe with it?
So I would say that actually I wouldn't write it again until we know what happens with Trump. Mm-hmm. Because since I wrote it, I finished the book in about 2019, and you could actually write quite a hopeful story about the reversal of some of these strongman tendencies. So some of the people I write about are no longer in power. Duterte had to leave power in the Philippines. Bolsonaro lost power in Brazil. Boris Johnson in Britain, who's a bit of a, not really a strongman figure, but in a different context might have been, but Brexit's been discredited. Trump lost office. Others, Erdogan's had a bad election. Modi has had a bad election. And I think there's a lesson there, which is that these guys offer, and they're all guys, incidentally, because it's a very macho style of leadership. Maloney actually would be an interesting one. But they offer a very simple-minded form of leadership, which is superficially attractive. Then they come into power, and often when they're in power, it doesn't work out so well. So if they haven't succeeded in turning their country's Orban style into a kind of fake democracy, then people often vote them out, or they want to try something else after a while. So that's the hopeful thing. But I think that, just to reprise our conversation, if Putin is seen to be successful in Ukraine, and he is actually where the book starts, because he is the first one, and there was a pattern that I noticed writing the book, that these strongman leaders, particularly the ones who came to power when democracy still felt like the wave of the future, they all start by saying, I'm a Democrat. That's what Putin said, it's what Erdogan said, and then they become more and more autocratic over time. And then, we now know what Putin is. If he lost in Ukraine, then we'd have another example of strongman leadership has failed. If he comes out of it looking like a victor, then a lot of people around the world will say, well, it was bad, but he toughed it out, and, he managed to come out victorious. So that style will be kind of, if not vindicated, more, they'll still have people who say, well, there's something to it. And similarly, if Trump comes back, then the people who are attracted to that style of leadership will be newly encouraged. But I think another lesson of the book is that it's never over. There's not a moment where you say, oh, well, it was a mistake to say democracy had won and there was no alternative, history had ended. And it would equally be a mistake, even if Trump wins, to say, oh, well, that's it, democracy's over. Actually, you can see there's these countries, a lot of countries are split 50-50. I mean, Trump, Hillary was 50-50. If he wins or Harris wins, it'll be 51-49. Brexit was 52-48. Poland, the same, 50-50. These are, for some reason, countries are very divided, but right down the middle between liberalism and autocracy. And actually, liberalism is the better system. So eventually, I think it will win. But it's not going to be a straight line in the way that people thought perhaps in 20 years ago.
I can't miss the opportunity to ask you the same question. What's your nightmare of the future autocrats in Europe?
I think democracy, as Gideon said, is really has a hard time. And for us in Central and Eastern Europe, it is even harder because we lived under some sort of a glass ceiling for a very long time. We regained our freedom and we said we're Democrats, and everybody believed us and we believed it. But then it turned out that it was much more difficult to be a Democrat every day and to build a country which is democratic every day, and to build institutions that can uphold democracy every day. And I think this is an uphill battle, and we're going to be in for a couple of years, which will be quite difficult.
The last question. Looking at the biography of Mr. Rachman, he started his career in BBC World Service in 1984.
Mm-hmm.
Then in 2016, he won the Orwell Prize.
Yeah.
So too much coincidence. The question is, are you optimist about Europe and the world?
Not in the short term, but I think in the long term.
How short?
Well, I mean, I think it's going to be a rough 5 years or so. But I do think that, as I said earlier, that autocracy doesn't work very well. And there's a reason it was the Soviet system that collapsed rather than the Western system. I think even in China, that their long run of success is coming to a close. So yeah, I think in the long run I'm optimistic, but I think that it's hard to be. Well, as I keep saying, so much is going to ride on the American election. I think if Trump wins and there's a bad outcome to the war in Ukraine, the next year or two are going to look bad, but it's not the end of the story.
Ms. Tcherneva.
I have nothing to add. I just want to thank Gideon, but also Svilen for bringing him over. So
Well,
thanks
thank
a lot.
Thank you.
So
It's been a pleasure.
this is the end of discussion. Thank you. Applause. Now we have something like a little bit more than 20 minutes for Q&A session. There is a mic. The ladies will give you the mic, and please introduce yourself very shortly and keep it short and simple. I prefer the questions, not the statements, but this is a free country, so please just raise your hands and the lady will give you the mic.
Alexander Andreev, I'm a journalist working with the Deutsche Welle and recently with Capital newspaper in Bulgaria. My question is about left and right, to Mr. Rachman and to Vessela. Mr. Rachman mentioned Trump claiming that his electorate are the working people in America. Also, the FPÖ in Austria and AfD in Germany, they are claiming that lots of working people are voting for them. But traditionally, the workers are the electorate of the left-wing parties, like Social Democrats or Socialists. Is there a shift in the Western societies nowadays that working people are getting more conservative, or even these parties are called far right in Europe, and voting, working people voting for these parties is, in my opinion, somehow strange.
Well, I think it's I'm afraid, a kind of reminder of the 1930s, where far-right parties did portray themselves as representatives of the downtrodden, betrayed workers. I was just in Germany, and we were talking actually not about the AfD, but about the Sarah Wagenknecht party. And somebody said to me, well, you know, she used to be in Die Linke, but they said, well, she's a nationalist and she's a socialist. But I'm not saying she's a Nazi, but she is a nationalist and a socialist.
So basically a DAP.
And it's the old formula coming back a bit. But the reason perhaps that it's possible to combine nationalism and socialism again in the old way is because one of the critiques of globalization, which obviously resonates with a lot of people, is that it has enriched the educated elite in the West at the expense of the working class because their jobs were shipped to China, essentially. Yep. That's their argument. And so for those, and then now in an age of mass migration, Trump and others, the FPO, and not only have they shipped your jobs to China, now they're bringing in all these new people who aren't even from the country, who are changing the nature of the country. And sure, that's fine for the globalists because they'll wash their cars or mow their lawn, but it's terrible for the working man. So you can see why that formula is working at the moment.
Ms. Tcherneva, I'm thinking about ECFR, Mr. Zerka's recent report and poll about the understanding of ethnic or citizen understanding of Europeanness, because this concerns to some extent the same thing.
Yes, there is this survey that we did, which is about people's kind of idea of what is to be European, and that it's actually quite a traditional idea, to put it mildly, especially in some countries. But I would probably go back to your example of FPÖ and even AfD. I mean, if you remember, and I'm sure you do, AfD started off as an anti-Euro party, right? And they were declining, and at some point they decided they needed to find a big issue which is fears-based. So the euro was doing just fine, and nobody feared much. So they started talking about migration. It coincided with the 2015 migration crisis. Angela Merkel saying, "Wir schaffen das," and that was it. And then ever since, AfD has been climbing. The same for Sarah Wagenknecht, the same for FPÖ. A lot of these parties are about fears. And I think there is this kind of concern by a lot of the, I'm not sure whether we should call the working class, because there are many more. It's not only the working class, it's also the middle class. It's also, the aging population of Europe that worries that tomorrow is not going to be better than yesterday, and that their children are going to be worse off than they were themselves. And so these fears are what, to an extent, feeds these parties. And you're right, it's not right and left. It actually, left and right is not a cleavage that works that well anymore. And we have other cleavages in Europe right
That
now.
was always the, dare I say, the fascist proposition, was that left and right was the wrong way to think about society, and it was nation against, outsiders or something. That is the way that they argued. And it was really, left and right was, I guess, becoming the dominant cleavage was post-war, really.
So now they're basically using the far left and the far right, uniting in a way that
Saying our common enemy
isolate.
is liberalism.
Our common enemy is everybody else in the middle.
Yeah. But also this critique of liberalism, which they've now called neoliberalism. And the liberals, that's the one thing they agree on, is that the liberals are the bad guys.
Yep. Another question, or I'll pick two more.
In the beginning, you said that two key members of a potential Trump administration are now in jail or were in jail, and they would like to get back at the people that put them there potentially from the current administration, which got me to thinking, and please don't take this in any way as an argument for autocracy in any way, but this deep division that you talk about in the US, it's also visible in Europe because we have more and more parties entering the parliament every time. So people grow more and more divided if you look at the data. Bulgaria is one such example where we've gone to potentially 9 parties in the future parliament. It used to be 4 or 5. So we see people clearly becoming more and more divided. And in this environment that we have, the former leadership of the country, who's not unlike Orban in some ways, is saying, get back to me. I'm the best guy to do the job. Everything was doing well during my time. So vote for me again. And he's winning elections again. So in this volatile environment that we have, and this social media dispersing more and more, different groups forming of opinions, the problem isn't the problem for Europe lack of governance, because Bulgaria, for instance, wasn't able to maintain a government for more than 9 months.
Sure.
And now if you're elected mayor of a city and you have 10, groups in your city council, even you can't do the job because the city council is so divided. And then you find that the politicians are much more attuned to the short-term stimuli than to their agenda.
We got it. Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
So
No,
isn't that the end of democracy, how we understand it?
Well, I don't think it's the end of democracy, but it is the classic authoritarian argument, one of them, against democracy. Democracy is chaotic. It doesn't work. If you look at the Weimar Republic, there was a lot of fracturing of parties. They didn't have stable government. So the argument was, well, we need a strongman. There was the same in, Franco's Spain or Mussolini's Italy. That is always the argument that democracy doesn't work. It's a nice idea, but it produces chaos, and we need order. But of course, the order produces its own problems, which is not to say that, democracy, we should just accept a malfunctioning democracy and not try to improve it. There are improvements both to the way that, electoral systems, you can look at changing them to maybe increase the thresholds if you've got too much fracturing in systems. And I think there's also a responsibility amongst the politicians who basically do believe in democracy, particularly in periods like this, to try to work together. The Germans actually haven't been too bad at it. They have these very elaborate coalition agreements, and they can be a bit frustrating, but essentially Germany remains a pretty prosperous, well-governed country, despite having a very fractured political scene. So it is possible.
Yep. Another one? The ladies.
Hello. I will not stand up due to the camera.
Yep.
My name is Kremena Krumova. I'm a chief editor of the website Novetica, a media company. So my question is, you said during the discussion, some of you, that potential return of Trump will be a threat for democracy in Europe. And also Biden said this as well, if I remember. But recently, Mark Zuckerberg, for example, the founder of Meta and Facebook, he admitted that he censored Americans during the COVID pandemic based on pressure from the Biden and Harris administration. So I want to ask you, aren't you worried that this looming and creeping censorship, because we see now the same in Brazil with Musk, same in France with Telegram, etc., there are also laws. Isn't it the censorship a bigger threat to democracy than the free expression of the free expression that Trump and his supporters exercised, both on January 6th and later?
Yep.
Thank you.
No, I think that's totally wrong. So to take the examples you give, Zuckerberg and Meta and the censorship of COVID information during COVID. Now, maybe that was a mistake at the time, but if you think back, we were facing a health emergency. They felt that it was incredibly important that everyone should be vaccinated. And they made a decision under that pressure that what they regarded as false information, telling people that vaccines were dangerous, shouldn't be allowed to spread out there, because we are in a new media environment where this stuff can get out there. And if they thought that a lot of people would die, a lot of their citizens would die if this stuff got out there, then it may have been the wrong call, but it wasn't anti-democratic. Because I also think it's a mistake to believe that in a democracy there are no restrictions on freedom of speech. There always have been. So that in my own country, maybe we allow too much to be suppressed on the grounds of national security. But if there is, for example, an ongoing terrorist threat, and there's a police operation going on, they can go to the newspapers and the BBC and say, don't release this information, because if you do, there'll be a threat to people's lives. There is, I think, an argument about where you draw the line, and there always is in a democratic society. So right just now, there were these riots in Britain, and there was a lot of false information about who had done a murder had it been a migrant. It actually was the son of a migrant, but it wasn't a migrant. So the guy had been born in Britain. And there was a debate about what should be done about that. Actually, that information spread too freely on social media. They didn't shut it down. But Musk was saying, that Britain was turning into a totalitarian state because they were trying to repress it. But then, one of the classic definitions of the limits to free speech, I think it was an American court case, was you're not free to cry fire in a crowded theater. In other words, you're not free to cause people to stampede for the doors for no reason and maybe be trampled to death. There are some limits to what you can do, and equally, you're not allowed to libel people. They can sue you. That too is a restriction on freedom of speech. So I think that we're only just beginning to grapple with social media and what it can and can't do. But so far, social media has been allowed to, I hesitate to get away with, but to define itself as not like a newspaper, where we've always accepted you can't just libel somebody in a newspaper and not run the risk of being sued. On social media, they say, well, we're not a publisher, we're a phone company. So why would you hold the phone company liable if I ring him up and say Trump's a murderer? I'm allowed to say that on the phone. But in fact, I think we're discovering that the social media companies are actually publishers because they have algorithms. So Musk, for example, said, I'm going to change the algorithm to boost certain what he called banger accounts that he approves of. Well, if he's doing that, he's a publisher. He's publishing stuff. And I think at that point, he begins to take responsibility for, or should be held liable for what appears on his platform. And that's what's happening in Brazil, because the argument in Brazil was that they were promoting false information, that the election had been stolen, and that was led to a coup attempt, and that was a threat to Brazilian democracy. I can see you're shaking your head, so you don't agree with that, but that is the argument the Brazilians make. If that is correct, I think it's fair enough to shut it down, myself.
And by the way, just
Yep.
to add on the
Sorry.
Telegram story, because I think it's also important. Telegram was not censored. It was the head of Telegram who was indicted by the French authorities because he is liable for the usage of Telegram to sell drugs and other things.
And child pornography.
And child pornography. So this is a court case. It's not an act of censorship.
Hello, my name is Svetlana Kristova. I am sociologist, and as a university person, I would ask you to theorize a little bit about the difference between autocracy and totalitarianism, because you've been talking and your book is about different forms of autocracies
Sure.
of present day. But you often give examples about totalitarian societies from the 20th century, like Nazi Germany, Franco Spain. And obviously there is a difference, but still, is there a danger that autocracy can easily grow into
Yep.
this
Thank you.
hardest form?
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a continuum. So I don't think there's a firm line, and here you have totalitarianism, and there you have autocracy. That you can have forms of autocratic government that become steadily more totalitarian. I mean, maybe the distinction is that there's absolutely no civil society in a totalitarian system. That everything is controlled by the state, by the party, etc. But by that definition, even China's not fully totalitarian now, because they do have a kind of civil society. There's very little freedom of the press, but it's not like Maoism where everybody had to wear the same thing. I mean, maybe Xi is trying to edge them towards it because he's making everybody study Xi Jinping thought, which is a very kind of Maoist way of doing it. But China's changed so much that although I think he's moved the needle back, it was already autocratic and it's moving closer to totalitarianism, but it's not, the way it was in the worst of Mao's era. I mean, and I think similarly, Putin has moved from Russia being an unstable democracy to being an increasingly, society where the rule of law really didn't apply, and increasingly autocratic, to something where they used to have freedom of the press, sort of. Now they don't. So they're moving in a more totalitarian direction. But I remember, once in 2012, I was in Moscow and then I went to Beijing shortly afterwards. And I was on a stage in Moscow, a bit like this. And people were able to say on that stage, at a conference, incidentally, in which Putin had spoken that morning, that Putin is a dictator, and they could get away with that and they weren't locked up the next day. That wouldn't happen anymore. We've seen what's happened to Navalny, etc. But it was very striking to me then that I would then go to China and that would be impossible there. At that time in China, you could still talk about it in a restaurant in private. Now they wouldn't even do that. Russia was always a bit freer than China. And it's still a bit freer than China, but unfortunately both countries have moved in a more totalitarian direction. And obviously there are people who think that that's where we're moving as well in the West.
The last one very short. We have 3 minutes, so if you have very simple.
Здравейте, казвам се Симеон Христов. Ще се възползвам възможността да задам въпроса на български език, тъй като имаме синхронен превод. Аз съм възпитаник на Санкт-Петербургския държавен университет и преди да задам своя въпрос, искам да направя една препратка към Карл Шмидт и неговата концепция за политическия враг. Очевидно е, сега всеки един политически субект има свой политически враг, но тъй като засегнахме темата за урегулиране на конфликта в Украйна и за подсигуряване на архитектурата за сигурност в Европа, от това, което съм видял в периода на своето пребиваване в Русия, е, че колективният Запад е доста така устойчив образ на политическия враг. Моят въпрос е следният. Колко е устойчив образът на врага в лицето на Кремъл в една хипотетична ситуация, когато вече конфликтът в Украйна е разрешен?
Образа имате предвид образа в Европа на Русия?
Да, в Европа и в Щатите.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that we regarded the Russians as an enemy really until they invaded Ukraine. At that point, there was a kind of wake up. And now I think Russia is regarded as I don't know whether we'd use the term enemy, but as a danger and as a threat. Those words would definitely be used. And I can't see that changing until Putin goes, because we now sort of know what he's like. So there will be a state of kind of, even whatever happens in Ukraine, Russia is not going to be reintegrated into the common European home that actually Putin himself spoke of in Berlin in 2001 for a very long time, I think, unless we Putinize, which, as I say, I don't think is going to happen, although there'll be some people who'd like it to. But actually, Schmidt, it's an interesting figure. In fact, he's in the book because one of the weird things that's happened is a revival of interest in the thought of Carl Schmitt, who was actually a Nazi. He was a professor of law during the Nazi period in Berlin, but who said politics is divided along the friend-enemy distinction. And actually, people who are very interested in Schmitt's thought are very prominent in China. I mean, there's a whole school of Chinese political philosophy that have translated the works of Schmitt and regard him as a kind of guru, because he is, as somebody described him, liberalism's most brilliant enemy. And Dugin, the Russian philosopher, if you can call it that, was also very interested in Schmitt's thought and has written about him. So I think it was kind of a sign. Incidentally, Bolsonaro's chief advisor, also Schmittian. And actually, J.D. Vance made a reference to Carl Schmitt, although he was accusing the others of being Schmittians. But as some Republicans said to me, he shouldn't even have heard of Carl Schmitt. That's a bad sign in itself, So yeah, the revival of Schmitt's thoughts are really interesting and not very hopeful sign.
I started to wonder who in Bulgaria is fan of Schmitt. Final words. We are closing this discussion.
Because the question was whether we will continue regarding the Kremlin and Putin as an enemy even after the war is finished, and I think you answered it to a large extent. Yes, we will, as long as the same people who have started this war are still around. But there is always, of course, this part of Europe which thinks about resets. And we have seen this many, many times before. People have tried resets, and those resets have been very unsuccessful. So while I think Gideon is right, I think there is always the risk that we kind of get lured by the idea of the possibility of resets.
And I think Britain is a slightly odd place in that it's very unified in its hostility to Russia. There is no pro-Russia party really in Britain. Maybe Nigel Farage a little bit. But in most other European countries, and certainly in the States, there are groups who are sort of, if you call them, Putin understanders.
Yep. So thank you very much. This is the thank you part of this discussion. Thanks to organizers and European Council on Foreign Relations for this event. Thanks to Svilen about giving us opportunity to meet this distinguished gentleman here in Bulgaria. He's not the first comer. He's been in Bulgaria 20 years ago.
Yep.
He saw the difference in Sofia. And thanks to Peroto, our host this evening. Thank you.